Yeah, sit back.
There you go.
Yeah, here, sit over here, because we're going to be watching the thing there.
I'll sit directly in front of me. Are you okay with that?
Yeah.
Here, I'll sit in front of you.
I'll sit right
These are some house chairs.
Right
here. Yes,
here.
there you go.
This is just the most comfortable position that I could possibly
Get out of
have.
here.
That's great. I'm Joel, by the way.
Joel, I'm Josh. That's Joel.
Yeah, I think, well,
I did.
Wesley.
I said it a few times.
Yeah.
And you know Grace Zadorsky?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
You also know a guy named Lane. I went to school with him.
Yeah.
High school. I saw him in a picture. It's like, hey, I know that guy. We'll talk about that later.
Yeah.
But, yeah, that's Joel, it's Matt, and then Adam up there.
Wait. Who's Matt?
Matt's on the computer.
Okay. Let's make it.
Adam's on that computer.
Well,
We usually average more on Wednesday nights, which are like regular readings.
Yeah.
Monday nights are new.
I would say on Wednesday nights, 20 is probably the average. We've had up to 30.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it'll dip down to 15, but 20 plus.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you guys can get on campus, that'd be.
We're thinking about doing that next semester. Our Wednesday night study, you mean?
Mhm.
Yeah.
We're ready to go whenever you are.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and get started. I was just explaining that what we're trying this semester is something new. Our normal weekly studies meet on Wednesday nights at 7:30, and we still meet downtown. It's about 3 blocks from campus, average around 20 plus students every week, people. But we wanted to try something on campus this semester, so we're doing it 3 times on Monday nights. So if you can join us on Monday nights at 7:30, we're here in Brace Hall, otherwise known as Brace Lab, room 105. And we're going to do this, if you can see the screen. Tonight is October 14th, and we're just going to summarize our entire last semester. So the spring semester, we spent, 14 weeks making the case that there is a God. And tonight what we're doing is just summarizing for those maybe who weren't able to make all the weeks, or those of you that were maybe are freshmen this year and weren't here to see that, or just want a refresher. So we're doing that tonight, and then the last time this semester we're going to try a Monday night Ratio Christi study is on November 11th, the day before my wife's birthday. I'll write that on my calendar. So November 11th, Monday night, 7:30, and then we're going to summarize really what we're doing this semester, and that is making the case that Jesus, in fact, is God. So that's what we're doing. I'm the regional director for Ratio Christi. I oversee this ministry here in the Midwest. And then I serve as the chapter director here at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. We have 2 other chapter directors that work with me, and then of course we have student leadership. And we just started this ministry last year, and so we're growing, we're meeting people, we're developing the ministry, learning what to do, what not to do, and it's been really fun. And I would view it as a great success in standing up for Christianity and truth on the university campus here in Nebraska. Well, what we're going to do tonight is cover the 3 major arguments for the existence of God. The cosmological argument, the teleological argument, and the moral argument for God. Now the first 2, those are kind of big words. Might be easier just to remember them as the argument from the beginning and the argument for God from design. So the design argument, the beginning argument, and then of course the moral argument for God. And one thing to remember, and I try to remind myself to make this clear to those who might hear this or watch this, that these aren't proofs in the sense that we are claiming we can prove God with absolute certainty. That's not our claim. We're not saying that these are airtight. We think these are good, compelling reasons to believe that there is a God, but we're not anywhere close to, like a mathematical proof or proving God with absolute certainty with these arguments. Another thing to keep in mind is that with these arguments, we're not necessarily arguing for the God of the Bible. Okay? Now, as a Christian organization, Ratio Christi and I'm a Christian. Of course, we believe in the God of the Bible. But for the purposes of tonight, what we're doing is merely making the case that there is a God. So if you can think of it in this way, we have a group of theists over here who believe there is a supreme being, there is a God, whatever name you want to use for the supreme being. And then on the other side, in the other corner of the ring, if you will, would be the atheists, those who don't believe that there is a supreme being. And so this argument, or the arguments we're talking about tonight, are just discussing this issue. Now, of course, among theists, there's going to be differences in how they understand God and understand what God is like, and that's a separate topic, though. So clearly Christians, Muslims, other theists, Plato and Aristotle, they're all going to agree that there is a supreme being, but they're going to have different views or different beliefs about what that supreme being is like. And those are worthwhile conversations between theists to have. But in terms of this conversation, it's merely between theist and atheist. So another way to say this is most all theists throughout history have developed similar sort of arguments for their belief in a supreme being. You can find these type of arguments in Aristotle and Plato, Muslims I mentioned, Christian philosophers and theologians throughout history, Hindus who believe in a theistic concept of God. You find these sort of arguments all throughout history among different theistic groups, and all of them would affirm and agree that there is a supreme being. So I want to make that clear what we're doing tonight, so we don't overstate our case in what we're attempting to do tonight. I also want to give you the freedom. Sometimes Christians, I think, are a little bit hesitant to push back against these arguments because they fear that by doing so, they're somehow disagreeing with the conclusion of the arguments. Obviously, the conclusion of all these arguments is that, therefore, there is a God. However, I want to give you the freedom to push back against these arguments. Maybe one or more of these aren't good arguments. You might still believe in the conclusion that there is a God. You might just not think that these are good arguments for that conclusion. Clearly, there's terrible arguments for God out there, right? And I'll just give you a silly, simple one. You could set up an argument like, if Adam Johnson, myself, if I drive a black car, then God exists. Premise 2, I drive a black car, therefore conclusion, God exists. So that's an argument for God, and I believe in the conclusion, I believe God exists, but that would be a terrible argument to make that case. So you might find one of these arguments not a good argument, but you still agree with the conclusion. So I hope you understand what I mean. I want you to feel the freedom to push back and challenge maybe some of these premises in these arguments. Who knows? You might find a way to improve the arguments. That's happened, right? You have arguments for God and you see something that doesn't quite seem right, and so you think about it and work at it and you actually improve the argument. So that might be the case as well. So feel free to push back against them. The first, we're not going to go in this order. I'm actually going to start at the bottom with the moral argument for God. So here it is in a nutshell. I always like to begin, almost no matter what I'm teaching, is just give people at the beginning an overview of what we're covering. So in a nutshell, this is the basic argument, the moral argument. It starts out, premise 1, there is an objective moral law. Premise 2, an objective law must have a source. There must be some explanation of where it came from, a lawgiver, if you will. And then that gets us to the conclusion. Therefore, there is a moral lawgiver, which we would call God or supreme being. So that's the argument in a nutshell. It's just a bare bones version of the argument. And then we'll go through the premises, and I'll try to defend each premise. That's how we're going to work this tonight. So the first premise, there is an objective moral law. This argument is a little bit different than the other two. As you'll see, the other two arguments start out more with scientific evidence, if you will, and then build from that scientific evidence to the conclusion that there is a God. This argument doesn't. This argument begins with not something that's scientific or empirical, if you will. It begins with morality or our moral beliefs. Now, because it's different in that sense, some people don't like it as much, especially those who are more scientific oriented might not find this argument as compelling. But there's a case to be made that this argument might even be stronger or more compelling because it starts off with something that is even more firm, if you will, than scientific knowledge. It's kind of difficult because in our modern culture, at least right now, scientific knowledge seems to be the king in terms of what we have confidence in terms of our knowledge. However, morality, a lot of people would argue, is even stronger, or we know morality even more strongly than we do our scientific knowledge. And that's because, as many people would argue, our moral knowledge is self-evident. We're starting then with things that are self-evident. Things that don't need to be proven, things that don't need evidence, we just know intuitively, if you will. And this is not a new concept. In fact, our country was founded on the idea that there are self-evident truths that we don't have to prove or give evidence for, but we just know so strongly because they are self-evident. So you'll remember our Declaration of Independence starts off, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So that's what self-evident means. We don't have to prove it. We don't have to argue for it. We don't have to make a case. It's just something that we all find to be self-evident. That's intuitive, if you will. Well, let's talk for a minute here about what does it mean to be objective. When we say that morality is objective, what do we mean by that? Well, clearly the opposite of objective would be something that's subjective or relative. Sometimes that term is used. And something that's subjective or relative would be like humor. So you might find a certain movie or joke funny and I don't. So those sort of things are more subjective. Or the favorite flavor of ice cream, that's relative per person, relative, subjective in that sense. But objective would be something that is true for everyone. So we would say, especially in the terms of morality, the context of morality, we would say that rape is always wrong for everybody. It's not as though rape is wrong for me, but it's okay for you. No, we would say it's objectively wrong for everybody. So it's objective in that sense. It exists beyond our mere opinions and preferences. So to give the classic example, if some mad scientist would put something in our water tonight so that tomorrow morning we woke up and we all thought that rape was okay, that still wouldn't make rape okay, even though we all thought it was, because it exists. The truth that rape is evil or wrong exists objectively apart from our beliefs and ideas and preferences. Sometimes people don't understand relative morality. Subjective morality seems to be popular in some circles. Sometimes even on college campuses, a lot of college students will believe or promote relative morality. But oftentimes those who say that or claim relative morality often don't understand the implications from such a position. Think about it for a moment. If there is no objective morality, right, if everything in the moral realm is relative or subjective, if there's no objective morality, then serial killers do nothing wrong. Love is no better than hate. Freedom is no better than slavery. Tolerance is no better than intolerance. Religious crusades weren't wrong. You can't say that terrorism is wrong or that racism is wrong if there is no objective morality. If morality is relative and subjective, all you can really say about these things is that you don't prefer them or that you don't like them. So we're making the case with this first premise here that no, there are certain moral truths that are objective. real, moral realism, sometimes it's called. Well, let's move on to premise 2. Since we're covering 3 arguments tonight, we're going to go pretty quickly. Premise 2 says that if there's an objective moral law, moral truths, then it has to have some sort of an objective source. It has to come from somewhere. Now, immediately, people usually push back against this idea because they'll remember earlier we said that these moral truths are self-evident. And they'll say, well, if they're self-evident, then they don't need an explanation. The confusion here behind that statement is that they're confusing the knowledge of something with the existence of something. In philosophy, it's talked about in terms of they're confusing epistemology, how do we know things, with ontology, the existence of things. So they're confusing knowing with existing. Self-evident means you don't need an explanation for how you know it, but, this is what we're arguing for in premise 2, you still need an explanation for how it exists. How can this moral law, these moral truths, exist out there apart from us? And what we're arguing in this moral argument is that it points to something that exists beyond the physical universe. Now, why do I make that leap? Well, morality seems to be an immaterial thing, right? We can't put morality in a test tube. It seems to be immaterial, and it seems to be personal, right? So if it can't come from us, and it doesn't come from the physical realm, what it seems to indicate is that morality comes from a source outside the physical universe and a personal source, because morality is inherently personal. We know the difference between personal and impersonal things. This clicker is impersonal. Moral concepts don't really apply to this. The table cannot do anything immoral. Only persons really can do immoral things. We would even say of animals, they don't do anything immoral because they're not persons. So we would then posit the best explanation for the existence of this moral truth is that there's a personal being beyond the physical realm where these truths come from. Here's what we're not saying. Sometimes atheists will hear this argument and they'll misunderstand what we're saying. So let me try to clarify what we're not saying. We're not saying that atheists can't be moral people. They can. Nobody's perfect, obviously. But generally speaking, atheists can be moral. I know atheists that are more moral than I am. So we're not saying that atheists can't be moral people. We're also not saying that atheists don't know morality. In fact, that was covered in premise 1. We're saying that morality is self-evident. So, of course, nobody understands morality perfectly. I know I don't. But generally speaking, atheists can know moral truth. This is the argument. This is what we're trying to get at. We're making the case that atheists don't have a good explanation for the existence of morality or where morality has come from. They make attempts, right? And there's various attempts. I'm actually writing my PhD dissertation right now in philosophy in this realm of metaethics, and I'm arguing against a particular atheist who has made an attempt or has a model, an explanation of how there can be objective morality even though there is no God. But I would just say, that's part of the purpose of my dissertation, to push back against his argument and say it's not a good explanation, that a theistic God is a better explanation for that. That is the argument that we're making. An immaterial objective standard of justice requires a theistic God. That's what we're claiming here. And by the way, a lot of atheists agree with this part of the argument. So I could list off several names of well-known atheists who agree that, if there is no God, then there's no good explanation for objective morality. Therefore, they would hold that morality is relative or subjective, and they would just deny objective morality. So J.L. Mackie, Gilbert Harmon, Paul Draper, some famous atheists from the past, Bertrand Russell, Jacques Monod. So there's several atheists who would agree with this conclusion. I want to show you a video from William Lane Craig's ministry. He put together a good, short, few-minute video about the moral argument. So I'll show that to you guys now.
Can you be good without God? Let's find out. Absolutely astounding. There you have it. Undeniable proof that you can be good without believing in God. But wait, the question isn't, can you be good without believing in God? The question is, can you be good without God? See, here's the problem. If there is no God, what basis remains for objective good or bad, right or wrong? If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. And here's why. Without some objective reference point, we have no way of saying that something is really up or down. God's nature provides an objective reference point for moral values. It's the standard against which all actions and decisions are measured. But if there's no God, there's no objective reference point. All we're left with is one person's viewpoint, which is no more valid than anyone else's viewpoint. This kind of morality is subjective, not objective. It's like a preference for strawberry ice cream. The preference is in the subject, not the object. So it doesn't apply to other people. In the same way, subjective morality applies only to the subject. It's not valid or binding for anyone else. So, in a world without God, there can be no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. God has expressed his moral nature to us as commands. These provide the basis for moral duties. For example, God's essential attribute of love is expressed in his command to love your neighbor as yourself. This command provides a foundation upon which we can affirm the objective goodness of generosity, self-sacrifice, and equality. And we can condemn as objectively evil greed, abuse, and discrimination. This raises a problem. Is something good just because God wills it, or does God will something because it is good? The answer is neither one. Rather, God wills something because he is good. God is the standard of moral values, just as a live musical performance is the standard for a high-fidelity recording.
Without your love.
The more a recording sounds like the original, the better it is. Likewise, the more closely a moral action conforms to God's nature, the better it is. But if atheism is true, there is no ultimate standard. So there can be no moral obligations or duties. Who or what lays such duties upon us? No one. Remember, for the atheist, humans are just accidents of nature, highly evolved animals. But animals have no moral obligations to one another. When a cat kills a mouse, it hasn't done anything morally wrong. The cat's just being a cat. If God doesn't exist, we should view human behavior in the same way. No action should be considered morally right or wrong. But the problem is, good and bad, right and wrong, do exist. Just as our sense experience convinces us that the physical world is objectively real, our moral experience convinces us that moral values are objectively real. Every time you say, hey, that's not fair, that's wrong, that's an injustice, you affirm your belief in the existence of objective morals. We're well aware that child abuse, racial discrimination, and terrorism are wrong for everybody, always. Is this just a personal preference or opinion? No. The man who says that it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. What all this amounts to then is a moral argument for the existence of God. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. But objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. Atheism fails to provide a foundation for the moral reality every one of us experiences every day. In fact, The existence of objective morality points us directly to the existence of God.
All right, well, one thing we like to do at Ratio Christi is after we cover something, give everybody a chance to talk about it among themselves. So I'm going to give you guys a few minutes here if you just want to gather in one big group. I think that would make the most sense. And chat about this argument. Push back against it if you think there's a premise that you disagree with, and just have a good discussion about what you think of this argument. Do you find it compelling? Weaknesses? Strengths? So go ahead. I'll give you a few minutes. All right, let's move on to the next argument. The next one is the cosmological argument. And the next two that we're going to look at, as I mentioned earlier, both start with scientific evidence. And I'm not a scientist. My professional training has not been in science. So I lean on other scientists, at least for the first part of both of these arguments. As I mentioned before, I'm working on my PhD in philosophy, and so I kind of specialize in the first argument, the moral argument for God. So these other two arguments begin with scientific evidence. And that causes a lot of people, as I said before, especially in our modern culture, who value science greatly, and I do as well, to find these arguments very compelling. And so I'll just give you one example of one of the scientists that I lean on, because sometimes the science goes over my head since that's not my professional training. But this is a book written by Stephen Barr, who is a physics professor at the University of Delaware. So he's a professional scientist, obviously professor, and he has written a book that I find very powerful, and it covers these arguments among a few other things. He even makes the moral argument as a scientist, but he focuses most of his attention on the cosmological argument that we're covering now, and then the next argument, the argument from design. And as a professional scientist, I just find him to be very helpful and knowledgeable in these fields of science. So this is a book that I would highly recommend. I'll pass it around so everybody can take a look at it. Take a picture of the cover if you want to purchase your own copy. So here's the cosmological argument in a nutshell. And again, we're going to go quickly through these. I'm just giving you the bare bones version. And then if we had more time, we'd add more flesh to the bones, if you will. So premise 1, whatever has a beginning must have a cause. Premise 2, the universe had a beginning. Conclusion, therefore, the universe had a cause, which we call God. God is the best explanation as the cause of the universe. Now, we're not going to spend much time with premise 1 because that's a fairly well-established premise, at least in our modern culture. Because this basically is the foundation of science, right? The idea of causality. That when things happen, there's a cause behind them existing or things happening. Things just don't pop into existence. Things just don't happen randomly. I mean, if the crops are dying, as a scientist, they look for the cause. They just don't think it happens randomly. There's no explanation. They look for causes. That's the very foundation of science, the idea that things cause other things. They just don't pop into existence by themselves. So really what we're getting at here with premise 1 is just the law of causality, right? And if this wasn't true, science would be impossible. So I'm not going to spend any more time on premise 1. Whatever has a beginning must have a cause. Let's move on then to premise 2. Now, interestingly, you go back 100 plus years, and most people, including most scientists and thinkers, thought that the universe was eternal. It's called the steady state theory. And so most people, scientists, they thought that the universe existed from all eternity past. Okay. Now, atheists of the time, they understood that this supported their position because of the first premise is so well established. Anything that has a beginning needs a cause. If the universe didn't have a beginning, then it didn't need a cause. So atheists understood that this supported their position. In other words, the universe was self-existent in this sort of understanding. Over the last 150 years, though, all sorts of evidence has come in, scientific evidence has come in, that the universe is not eternal, that in fact the universe had a beginning. And we're not going to look at all that evidence tonight, we just don't have the time, but that book would go through all those scientific discoveries over the last 150 years that have led virtually all scientists today to affirm that the universe in fact had a beginning. So let me just show you some of their conclusions then. Everybody knows Stephen Hawking, probably the most famous scientist in the world. He said almost everyone now believes the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang, whatever you want to call it. At this, there was some sort of a beginning. Alexander Vilenkin is another well-known cosmologist, works in this field. He says, with the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no they have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Interesting enough, he calls it a problem. And I think it's because, again, premise one is so well established, everything that has a beginning must have a cause. And so this cries out for explanation, right? Since the universe had a beginning, it creates a problem in the sense that there must be a cause, and we have to explore and think through what could have been the cause of the universe. That's why he calls it a problem, if you will. Here's some other Nobel Prize winners who affirmed now. I'm not going to read all the quotes. I'll just throw them up on the PowerPoint for you. These are all Nobel Prize winning scientists who affirm that the universe, in fact, has a beginning. So I'm not giving you all the scientific evidence for it. That's in the book, and other times in Ratio Christi we've explored that evidence. But I'm just giving you the conclusion that scientists have come to because of that evidence, that the universe had a beginning. The next quote here I do want to read, and this is from an astronomer by the name of Robert Jastrow. I'll tell you just a little bit about him. He was the founder and director for 20 years of NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies. And take a look at this quote from Robert Jastrow. He writes, as an astronomer, he says, astronomers now find that they have painted themselves into a corner because they have proven by their own scientific methods that the world began abruptly in an act of creation to which you can trace the seeds of every star, every planet, every living thing in this cosmos and on the earth. And they found that all this happened as a product of forces they cannot hope to discover. That there are what I would call supernatural forces at work is now, I think, a scientifically proven fact. You might be shocked a little bit that he would use the term supernatural. Why would he think it's supernatural? Why does it have to be supernatural, this cause of the universe? Well, if you think about it for a moment, if nature, the universe, simply is space, time, and matter, that's what the universe is, right? That's what nature is, space, time, and matter. And if all of that, space and time and matter, had a beginning at the Big Bang, whatever you want to call it, the beginning of the universe, if all those things began at one point, then the cause must be beyond those things. It must be beyond space, must be beyond time, must be beyond matter. And by definition, that's what is supernatural, or beyond nature. That's why he refers to it as supernatural. Sometimes we think of supernatural as just, weird, creepy things, horror movies, so on and so forth. But no, technically the term supernatural just means something that's beyond the physical universe. And that seems to be where this leads. An unimaginably powerful cause to cause or create the universe out of nothing. That's what existed before the universe, is nothing, absolute nothing. Now, one of the first objections that'll come up or in this conversation, if you talk with somebody about this argument, they'll say, okay, well then, what caused God? And maybe you've encountered that objection yourself. Okay, what caused God then? If everything needs a cause, then what caused God? But they misunderstood us when they bring that objection, because we didn't say, remember the first premise, doesn't say everything needs a cause. It says everything that has a beginning needs a cause, right? So when people thought that the universe was eternal, they knew that the universe didn't need a cause, because it's only things that have a beginning need a cause. And that's why, atheists held so strongly to that idea as long as they could until all this evidence came in that the universe had a beginning. But they tried to hold on to the idea that the universe was eternal because they knew if something didn't have a beginning, then it didn't need a cause. And that's what we're claiming about God. As theists, most all theists would understand the Supreme Being as never having a beginning. Therefore, it doesn't need a cause. Well, just like with the other argument, I want to show you a quick video. Again, this is from William Lane Craig's ministry. A good video summarizing just a few minutes this second argument for God, the cosmological argument.
Does God exist? Or is the material universe all that is, or ever was, or ever will be? One approach to answering this question is the cosmological argument. It goes like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Is the first premise true? Let's consider. Believing that something can pop into existence without a cause is more of a stretch than believing in magic. At least with magic, you've got a hat and a magician. And if something can come into being from nothing, then why don't we see this happening all the time? No, everyday experience and scientific evidence confirm our first premise. If something begins to exist, it must have a cause. But what about our second premise? Did the universe begin, or has it always existed? Atheists have typically said that the universe has been here forever. The universe is just there, and that's all. First, let's consider the second law of thermodynamics. It tells us the universe is slowly running out of usable energy, and that's the point. If the universe had been here forever, it would have run out of usable energy by now. The second law points us to a universe that has a definite beginning. This is further confirmed by a series of remarkable scientific discoveries. In 1915, Albert Einstein presented his general theory of relativity. This allowed us, for the first time, to talk meaningfully about the past history of the universe. Next, Alexander Friedman and George Lemaitre, each working with Einstein's equations, predicted that the universe is expanding. Then in 1929, Edwin Hubble measured the red shift in light from distant galaxies. This empirical evidence confirmed not only that the universe is expanding, but that it sprang into being from a single point in the finite past. It was a monumental discovery, almost beyond comprehension. However, not everyone is fond of a finite universe, so it wasn't long before alternative models popped into existence. But one by one, these models failed to stand the test of time. More recently, three leading cosmologists, Arvin Bord, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin, proved that any universe which has on average been expanding throughout its history cannot be eternal in the past, but must have an absolute beginning. This even applies to the multiverse, if there is such a thing. This means that scientists can no longer hide behind a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Any adequate model must have a beginning, just like the standard model. It's quite plausible then that both premises of the argument are true. This means that the conclusion is also true. The universe has a cause. And since the universe can't cause itself, its cause must be beyond the space-time universe. It must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, uncaused, and unimaginably powerful, much like God. The cosmological argument shows that, in fact, it is quite reasonable to believe that God does exist.
All right, well, just like before, I want to give you guys a few minutes here to chat about the argument. There it is in a nutshell. Now, of course, you can always add more flesh to the bones, and we've done that a little bit through the video. But get together again and discuss for a few minutes what you think about this argument. Find it compelling, not. If you're going to push back against it, what premise would you attack? So I'll give you guys a few minutes here. right, well, let's head on into the last argument. There's a sense in which maybe I've saved the best for last here. The next one is my favorite. I find the next one to be the most compelling argument for God, and I'm not alone. In fact, there are many, many atheists who admit that this next argument, the teleological argument, is the strongest argument for the existence of God. Now, obviously, it's not strong enough for those atheists because they're still atheists, but I think it's fair to admit of your opponents what you find to be their strongest argument. I do the same thing of people that I disagree with. So many atheists, including many theists, of course, would say this next argument is the strongest or most compelling argument for the existence of God. So here again, in a nutshell, is the teleological argument. Bare bones version. We'll add a little bit of flesh to the bones, but I just want to start out, as always, with just the bare basic two premises and a conclusion. So premise one, every design has a designer. This is just an empirical observation. We've just never seen design come from anything but a designer. This is just an empirical observation. We, as the human race, have just never seen design from anything but a designer. Premise two, there's actually two arguments here. It seems as though the universe has a design. It also seems that life has design. So you can take this argument in two directions. You can go down the path, and we'll do that a little bit, with just that the universe itself seems to have design. The second way you can go with this argument is to make the case that life seems to be designed. And we'll do that a little bit as well. So there's two type of arguments, and there's many more, but we're just boiling it down to the basic two teleological arguments tonight. The conclusion from both of them would be then, therefore, the universe or life has a designer that designed this design, which we call God. All right. Well, how do we detect design? Let's just think about that for a moment. How do we detect design? Sometimes it's very obvious. When we detect design, sometimes we have to think about it and evaluate the situation. The classic example is if you come across a watch on the beach, right? If somebody finds a watch when they're walking on the sand, nobody questions for a moment whether that was designed or not. That's an obvious situation. Sometimes, maybe for an archaeologist, it's a little bit more difficult. So imagine an archaeologist who's digging through the dirt and they're looking for artifacts from previous civilizations, and they find what they don't know might be a stone, a flat stone, or a plate, let's say. And so it might be difficult at first to know if there's design here or not. But one thing that archaeologists, as well as forensic scientists, look for when they're trying to discover design or detect design is they're really looking for two things. They're looking for specificity and complexity. So specificity, this would be a non-random arrangement, okay? And if an archaeologist or a forensic scientist finds something with non-random arrangement, then they know fairly quickly that they've found something that was designed, right? So go back to that example of a rock, a stone. It's flat, it's circular, but that might not have been designed. That might have happened naturally. But let's say they flip it over, and on the back there is writing in some language. Well, then they don't even have to think about it. Immediately they know it was designed because you've got in that language something that is non-random and arranged in a certain way. And that just screams design. Anything language, even if we don't know the language, it just screams design. The other thing they look for is complexity, multiple pieces. So let's say, go back to the watch example, if they were discovering, an archaeologist is trying to find things in the dirt, and they find some sort of an ancient contraption that had multiple pieces and parts, maybe a stone and then a board and a piece of iron. And so again, if something had multiple parts, that would indicate strongly that it was designed. So they look for both of those things, specificity and complexity. Multiple pieces, complex, and specificity. Language, again, is the clear-cut example. If we find complexity, in written words, there's lots of parts to it, different letters, words, sentences, and it's specified, non-random arrangement. An atheist recognized this principle, right? I always use the example from a movie from the 90s, a movie that I really enjoy. Watched it last year with RatioChristi. But it was put together and written by an atheist, okay? So just to give you a little bit of context. And what I'm trying to say with this movie is that atheists recognize this idea of specified complexity points to a designer. Because in the context of the movie, what's going on is that they're looking for extraterrestrial life. The movie is about this organization, a real-life organization. It's a fictional movie, but it's about this real-life organization called SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And as you can see from the cover, from the movie poster, they're pointing these satellites out into space, hoping to find intelligent life out there, right? Which is a viable project. I don't have any problem with that whatsoever. In the movie, however, they discover something through these satellites which confirms their belief. They don't even question it. As soon as they find this or hear this stuff with their satellites, they know immediately they have discovered intelligent life. Well, you might ask, what did they find? What did they hear with their satellites? Again, it's in the movie. It's fictional, but it was written by an atheist, put together by an atheist. And I'm using this to make my point that they even they recognize this idea of detecting design. What they discover in the movie through these satellites is a signal coming to Earth from outer space, a signal of all the prime numbers from 1 to 100 in the right order. So it's just, little beeps, if you've seen the movie, but it's little beeps that indicate numbers. And what it is all the prime numbers in order from 1 to 100. And when they hear that signal coming from outer space, they know immediately that they've found design. They found intelligence. Why? Same thing I just said the archaeologists and forensic scientists look for. It's something that's specified, and it's something that is complex. Complex, there's multiple parts to it, there's multiple numbers, and there's a non-random arrangement to it. It's 1 to 100, all the prime numbers in a row from 1 to 100. So this idea of detecting design isn't unique to us theists. It's used by scientists, and atheists recognize it as well. So when we look at the universe and life, where do we see design? Let's just start with the universe. You might be familiar with the fine-tuning argument for God. That's what this is, the fine-tuning argument for God. And that's just that in our universe, there seems to be these mathematical or physical constants in our universe that seem to be very finely tuned. Almost, if you will, like there's some sort of a control center of the universe. Then somebody had set all these dials to be exactly just right so that life could exist in our universe. We're talking about things like the gravitational constant, the expansion rate of the universe. The video will show us more, but there's more than 100 of these scientific physical constants of our universe that seem to be dialed in just precisely right so that life could exist. In other words, if any of these constants were off just by a little hair, then life wouldn't be possible. So it seems as though this universe has been very finely tuned or designed, which indicates a designer behind it. Another example is life. So we talked about the universe seems to indicate design, but also life itself seems to be designed. And I'll just, for the sake of time tonight, just look at one example, and that is DNA. One of our students, our student president last year, gave a great lecture on this about DNA and how there seems to be information encoded That's what DNA seems to be, is information. Going back to the idea of language, if an archaeologist finds a plate with a language or words written on it, that just screams design. And similarly, DNA seems to be that as well. So DNA, this is a quote from Bill Gates. He says DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software we as humans have ever created. Just take a real simple example here. You've got a single-celled organism, an amoeba, right? The classic single-celled organism, simple life, if you will. And you go back 100, 150 years, and scientists mostly thought, this is very simple. This amoeba, a single-celled organism, it's mostly just a blob of a protoplasm. And so it was easy for them just to think, maybe some chemicals came together in some primordial soup at one point, and then just, these single-cell organisms arose from that. Because they didn't have the microscope technology to dive into and really see the complexity, even in a simple one-cell amoeba. But as our telescopes have helped us to get a better understanding of the universe, our microscopes have given us a better understanding of so-called simple life. And what we found is that even the single-cell organism, the amoeba, is anything but simple. What we've discovered is that they're actually factories building other factories. It's incredible. And then in the 1950s, DNA was confirmed as containing our genetic information. So what we have in DNA is this encoded instructions for how to build all living things. Human DNA, amoeba DNA, that's what it is. It's like a code or instructions on how to build more of that particular kind. And it's not merely a sentence. Go back to the plate example. Maybe a plate an archaeologist would have a sentence written around the plate. But just think of the amoeba for a moment. Simple life, not even human or cat or anything like that. Just a single-celled organism, an amoeba. And the DNA necessary to write out all the instructions to build another amoeba, so amoeba DNA, if you would write it all out, it would take 1,000 volumes of an encyclopedia to write all that out just for an amoeba. So you talk about information, you talk about specified complexity. It just seems to scream for an explanation, for a designer, for this design, for this specified complexity. So with our last argument here, we'll do the same thing. I want to show you a quick video from William Lane Craig's ministry about this. He's specifically going to focus on the fine-tuning aspect. So design in the universe is how he's going to take this argument. So here you go.
From galaxies and stars, down to atoms and subatomic particles, the very structure of our universe is determined by these numbers. These are the fundamental constants and quantities of the universe. Scientists have come to the shocking realization that each of these numbers has been carefully dialed to an astonishingly precise value, a value that falls within an exceedingly narrow, life-permitting range. If any one of these numbers were altered by even a hair's breadth, no physical, interactive life of any kind could exist anywhere. There'd be no stars, no life, no planets, no chemistry. Consider gravity, for example. The force of gravity is determined by the gravitational constant. If this constant varied by just 1 in 10 to the 60th parts, none of us would exist. To understand how exceedingly narrow this life-permitting range is, imagine a dial divided into 10 to the 60th increments. To get a handle on how many tiny points on the dial this is, compare it to the number of cells in your body, or the number of seconds that have ticked by since time began. If the gravitational constant had been out of tune by just one of these infinitesimally small increments, the universe would either have expanded and thinned out so rapidly that no stars could form and life couldn't exist, or it would have collapsed back on itself with the same result: no stars, no planets, and no life. Or consider the expansion rate of the universe. This is driven by the cosmological constant. A change in its value by a mere 1 part in 10 to the 120th parts would cause the universe to expand too rapidly, or too slowly. In either case, the universe would again be life prohibiting. Or another example of fine-tuning. If the mass and energy of the early universe were not evenly distributed to an incomprehensible precision of 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd, the universe would be hostile to life of any kind. The fact is, our universe permits physical, interactive life only because these, and many other numbers, have been independently and exquisitely balanced on a razor's edge. Wherever physicists look, they see examples of fine-tuning. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. If anyone claims not to be surprised by the special features that the universe has, he's hiding his head in the sand. These special features are surprising and unlikely. What is the best explanation for this astounding phenomenon? There are 3 live options. The fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Which of these options is the most plausible? According to this alternative, the universe must be life permitting. The precise values of these constants and quantities could not be otherwise. But is this plausible? Is a life prohibiting universe impossible? Far from it. It's not only possible, it's far more likely than a life permitting universe. The constants and quantities are not determined by the laws of nature. There's no reason or evidence to suggest that fine-tuning is necessary. How about chance? Did we just get really, 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 really lucky? No. The probabilities involved are so ridiculously remote as to put the fine-tuning well beyond the reach of chance. So, in an effort to keep this option alive, some have gone beyond empirical science and opted for a more speculative approach, known as the multiverse. They imagine a universe generator that cranks out such a vast number of universes that, odds are, life-permitting universes will eventually pop out. However, there's no scientific evidence for the existence of this multiverse. It cannot be detected, observed, measured, or proved. And the universe generator itself would require an enormous amount of fine-tuning. Furthermore, small patches of order are far more probable than big ones. So the most probable observable universe would be a small one, inhabited by a single, simple observer. But what we actually observe is the very thing that we should least expect: a vast, spectacularly complex, highly ordered universe, inhabited by billions of other observers. So even if the multiverse existed, which is a moot point, it wouldn't do anything to explain the fine-tuning. Given the implausibility of physical necessity or chance, the best explanation for why the universe is fine-tuned for life may very well be it was designed that way. A common-sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super-intellect monkeyed with physics, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. There is for me powerful evidence that there is something going on behind it all. It seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge.
All right, one last time, get together as a group, and I'll give you a few minutes to evaluate and chat about this argument together.
This-
looking at this
True.
on its own, the only way the main way I could think, it's like you roll a trillion sided, like you're telling a story to someone, oh, I had this trillion sided dice, and if I rolled a specific number, I wouldn't shoot myself, but if I rolled any other number, I'd do it. The fact that you're telling that story, you obviously rolled that number.
Oh, sure.
You know that you got that 1 in a trillion chance. The fact that we're even here to talk about it means that we could have.
I have an answer to that. I just gotta find it.
All right, let me wrap things up a little bit, and then we can move back to the discussion. And in Raja Christi, that's what we always say, is that these little 3, 4, 5-minute discussion times are just supposed to be the beginning of conversations that hopefully will take that will continue afterwards or throughout the week as you guys meet for coffee or get together. We want to continue these sort of conversations. So let me just summarize maybe some things that we can infer from these arguments about this first cause or God or whatever supreme being. We're going to use that term. So I think from the cosmological argument we can infer that this cause, supreme being, is immaterial, timeless, spaceless. We discussed that. And extremely powerful. Being able to create the entire universe out of nothing seems to imply that he has a tremendous amount of power. Design, the teleological argument. He also seems to be intelligent, to be able to design the universe and life, as we said. Bill Gates, the most advanced software program that we've ever seen, much more advanced than what we've created, i.e. DNA, human DNA, life, DNA in general, even the amoeba. So extremely intelligent, and then has a purpose. So what design seems to imply, when an archaeologist finds a plate, when somebody designs something, there's a purpose to it or an intent for it. We don't design things for no reason. Even art has a purpose. If we design something, it's to accomplish its intent, purpose behind it. So if the universe, life, has design, it would imply there's a purpose here, that this cause or supreme being has intentionality, if you will. From the moral argument, I think you can make a good case that this being must be morally perfect, right? If morality comes from this being, you would think that the source has to be perfection. This goes back to even Plato's argument about the forms, where he would say all the forms, all of his ideas, abstract objects, whatever you want to call them, come from the good, from something that is perfect. So if this is the source of morality, you would think the source is perfect for morality to come from it. I think a case can be made for that. And then also, as I mentioned before, the moral argument seems to imply that this supreme being is personal. Morality is a personal thing. It wouldn't make sense for the source of morality itself to be impersonal. We know what impersonal things are: tables, rocks, a star, right? How could morality come from something that's impersonal, if you will, an impersonal being? So no, it makes sense that this being is personal in that sense. So there's some conclusions we can make from these arguments that seems to point out what this supreme being is like. And most theists would agree with these things. And as I said before, tonight we're not doing an arguments between theists, because different theists have different ideas about what this supreme being is like. No, we're really just putting the theist in one category and the atheist in another, and making the case for theism in general. What we're doing this semester at Ratio Christi on Wednesday nights is we're taking that next step, if you will. So as Christians, we're a Christian organization. We believe not only in a supreme being, but we believe that Jesus is that supreme being. We think that Jesus is God. And so this whole semester, we're spending 14, 15 weeks making the case that Jesus is God. So if you join us on Wednesday night, you can be a part of that conversation and see the evidence that we're giving out of why we believe as Christians that Christianity is true. So we invite everybody to that on Wednesday nights. So let me wrap things up there, and feel free to stay and continue the conversation. I want to thank anybody that joined us online watching this, and those who watch it later. Are there any questions we could address? A lot of times at Ratio Christi we like to do Q&A afterwards. So if there's anything that I can help out with, we could do a short Q&A for a while, and then you guys can discuss on your own. Wesley, yes?
I have a question. So the fine-tuning argument, there's a lot of argument against chance. But when the argument comes from necessity, it just it goes, you know, it's not only possible, it's far more likely that it would be something else. And I've had a conversation with someone who brought forth the necessity argument, like it had to be this way, otherwise we wouldn't be here, or, you know, no one's really saying this. And I remember getting past it at one point, but now I'm like, okay, well, how do you argue against the necessity argument other than just it seems like the constants could be something else. I don't know how to answer that.
Yeah, I mean, it would be very difficult, I think, you know, to make the case that these laws of nature, these fine-tuning constants of the universe are necessary. I mean, you could posit that as an idea, right? I mean, as we talk a lot about in Ratio Christi, a lot of things are possible. It's easy to posit possibilities or ideas, but I'm not sure how somebody could make a case for that. How could you make a case that these constants are necessary? That would seem a very difficult position to be in. I know there are those who claim that, but that's my pushback. Is I'm willing to believe your claim, just like with anything. You know, some people will say, for example, Jesus married Mary Magdalene and then had children, or Jesus was an alien from another planet. That's why you could do these miracles and stuff. And I'm open to any of those possibilities. Of course, those are possibilities. But whatever theory you have, you've got to defend it. You know, what reasons and evidence do you have to think that the laws of nature or these fine-tuning constants are necessary? And it seems like that would be difficult to try to make a case for that.
Sure.
That'd be my simplest, quickest answer. Good. Any other questions tonight? Thoughts? William Lane Craig has a really funny, if you could find that online, I'm sure somebody's posted it, but he has a really good comical approach to that idea, where he actually does a Western cowboy impression, if you can imagine William Lane Craig doing that. But he has a good comical reply to the idea that these fine-tuning constants are necessary. All right, anything else? Otherwise, I'll let you guys get back to the conversation if you so care to do so. So, thanks for coming tonight, guys. I appreciate it.
Do you ever hear those arguments before, or any of this stuff before, Preston? Oh yeah? Have you memorized them like I have? All right. Next step. Okay, cool. Yeah, you said something really cool at the